The Invisible Prison You Were Born Into, a philosophical documentary, presented by The Project Rise. Chapter 1, The Comfortable Illusion. A single chair sits in an empty white room. The camera holds. Nothing moves. Then, a voice. Somewhere in your life, on an ordinary day you don't remember, you decided who you are, except you didn't. Someone else did, and then handed you the paperwork and told you to sign it as if it had always been yours. This is not an accusation. It is an invitation to look at the signature. Most people move through their entire lives without asking a single uncomfortable question about the self that is doing the moving. They wake up, they perform a name, a set of preferences, a moral code, a way of loving, a way of failing, and they call the whole arrangement me. It works. It is efficient. It lets you get to work on time. But efficiency is not the same as truth, and the self you rely on every morning was assembled long before you had the tools to inspect its parts. Consider how strange it is that you did not choose your first language, and yet that language chose the shape of your first thoughts. You did not choose the faces that hovered over your crib, and yet those faces taught your nervous system what safety feels like, what abandonment feels like, what love is supposed to cost. By the time you were old enough to ask, "Who am I?" the question had already been answered without your consent, in a voice that sounded exactly like your own. This is the comfortable illusion, the belief that the self is a discovery rather than a construction. We like to imagine that somewhere beneath the noise of upbringing and culture there sits an original, untouched core, the real me waiting to be found, like a fossil under sediment. It is a beautiful idea. It is also largely a myth, and myths persist not because they are true, but because the alternative is harder to live with. The alternative is this: there was no fossil. There was only sediment, layer after layer of it, laid down by people and institutions and accidents of geography. And at some point the sediment became dense enough to stand up, walk around, and call itself a person. The first deception. Psychologists who study early development describe something called attachment patterning, the way an infant's brain calibrates itself to its caregivers within the first 2 years of life, long before memory as you know it even begins recording. You cannot remember this calibration happening, and yet it is still running, silently, underneath every relationship you have ever had. The people you are drawn to, the people who make you anxious, the ways you interpret silence from someone you love. Much of it was written before you could write your own name. This is a first deception, and it is not malicious. No one sat down and planned it. It happened the way weather happens, through pressure systems no single person controls. But the fact that no one is to blame does not mean no one is affected. You were affected. You are still being affected every day by decisions made on your behalf when you were too small to object. So here's the question this film will not let go of. If the earliest architecture of your personality was built by hands that were not yours, in a language you didn't yet speak, for purposes you never approved, in what sense is the resulting structure actually you? A species that forgets its own beginning. There is something almost merciful about the way memory works. It does not begin recording in earnest until somewhere around the 3rd or 4th year of life, which means the single most formative stretch of your existence. The years in which your nervous system decided what danger looks like, what comfort sounds like, what kind of person is safe to trust, occurred entirely off camera. You were there. You are simply not allowed to watch the footage. This has a strange consequence. It means every human being alive is, in a very literal sense, a stranger to their own origin story. You know the plot only because someone told it to you afterward, in fragments, usually flattering ones. The actual formation of the self took place in the dark, and by the time the lights came on, the architecture was already load-bearing. It is worth sitting with how unusual this arrangement is. In almost every other domain of life, we insist on knowing the terms before we agree to them. We read the contract. We asked about the warranty. And yet the single most consequential agreement of your life, the terms under which your personality, your fears, and your desires were installed, was signed before you could read, by a version of you too young to understand what a contract even was. Why we protect the illusion. There is a reason people resist this question, and it isn't stupidity. It's cost. To admit that the self is constructed is to admit that it could have been constructed differently, that the version of you sitting here right now is one draft among many possible drafts, and the others were never even considered. That is a vertiginous thought. It threatens the stability of everything you have built your life on top of: your certainties, your grudges, your loyalties, your taste in music, your fear of the ocean, your belief that you are just not a morning person. So the mind does something clever. It takes a constructed self and stamps it with a label that reads natural, original, mine. The stamp is fake. But once it's applied, nobody checks the paperwork again. This documentary is going to check the paperwork, not to demolish you. Demolition is easy and it is cheap theater. What we are after is something slower and more useful, an inventory. Before you can decide what in you is worth keeping, you first have to find out what was ever actually chosen and what was simply installed. Because here is a quiet, uncomfortable truth hiding underneath the comfortable illusion. The truth this entire film exists to unfold. The person you call yourself was built before you were old enough to choose. What happens next depends on what you do with that fact. The cost of looking away. You might ask why any of this matters. Practically speaking, you have a life to run. The illusion, comfortable as it is, seems to work well enough. Bills get paid. Relationships continue. Mornings arrive and are survived. Why disturb a system that appears on the surface to be functioning? The answer is that the illusion does not actually make decisions disappear.
The answer is that the illusion does not actually make decisions disappear. It merely hides where many of them came from. Every day feels like a sequence of private choices. You choose what to admire. You choose whom to trust. You choose what offends you, what comforts you, what future seems worth pursuing. From the inside, these decisions feel immediate, personal, even spontaneous. Consciousness has a remarkable talent for arriving after a decision and quietly claiming authorship. Modern psychology suggests that many mental processes unfold outside conscious awareness before they become available to introspection. The precise relationship between unconscious processing and conscious choice remains debated, but one fact is difficult to escape. Much of the mind's activity occurs beyond the narrow spotlight of awareness. The story you tell yourself about why you acted is not always the mechanism that produced the action. This is not evidence that free will is an illusion. It is evidence that self-knowledge is harder than it appears. Imagine standing in front of a vast cathedral while carrying only a flashlight. Wherever the beam falls, you become convinced you understand the building. The pillars, the stone, the stained glass, they seem complete. Yet the flashlight illuminates only a tiny fraction of the structure. Darkness is mistaken for absence simply because it cannot be seen. Consciousness often functions in much the same way. The portion of yourself available to immediate inspection is astonishingly small compared with the network of habits, emotional associations, physiological responses, memories, expectations, and learned patterns quietly supporting it. What feels like a complete picture may only be the part that happens to be illuminated. This should not be surprising. Evolution did not design the human mind primarily to explain itself. It shaped nervous systems capable of surviving long enough to reproduce. An animal that pauses to perform philosophical self-analysis every time it hears a rustle in the bushes rarely becomes an ancestor. Speed frequently mattered more than certainty. Efficient approximations often mattered more than objective truth. The consequence is subtle but profound. The mind is not merely a machine for discovering reality. It is also a machine for constructing a version of reality that is useful enough to navigate. Those two goals overlap, but they are not identical. Sometimes the most adaptive belief is also true. Sometimes it is merely comforting. Sometimes it is neither. And because our own thoughts arrive already translated into the familiar voice we call mine, distinguishing between discovery and construction becomes one of the most difficult tasks a human being can attempt. This is where the invisible prison begins to reveal itself. Not as walls, not as chains, but as assumptions so deeply woven into perception that they disappear completely. A prison whose bars cannot be seen is rarely questioned. A prison whose bars feel like your own personality is rarely escaped. And perhaps that is the most remarkable feature of all. The strongest prisons in history have always required guards. This one recruits its prisoners instead. Because once an idea becomes part of your identity, you begin protecting it as though it were protecting you. That is the paradox. The self becomes both the architect of the prison and the reason it cannot imagine another landscape. The walls are no longer outside. They have become the language through which the outside is interpreted. And when the prison becomes the lens, every horizon begins to resemble another wall. Silence. The room is still empty. The chair has not moved. Only now it no longer looks like furniture. It looks like evidence. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Identity. Every building starts with constraints before it starts with design. The shape of the land, the direction of the wind, the load the soil can bear, these are decided before a single wall goes up, and no architect, however brilliant, can simply wish them away. A self is built the same way. Long before personality, there is terrain. Your terrain included a family with its own unspoken rules about anger, about money, about who gets to be right. It included a culture that had already decided, before you were born, which emotions were acceptable to show in public and which ones needed to be swallowed. It included a body, a particular nervous system, a particular temperament, a particular sensitivity to noise or rejection or praise that you did not select from a catalog. All of this arrived first. You arrived second, into a house that was already under construction. The rooms you didn't design. Developmental psychology has a name for the process by which a child absorbs the emotional logic of its environment. Internalization. It's an unglamorous word for something enormous. A child doesn't just learn what its parents say. It learns what its parents fear, and then it builds a room in itself shaped exactly like that fear, and moves in without ever signing a lease. If a household treated conflict as dangerous, a child will often grow into an adult who feels physically ill at the first sign of disagreement. Not because disagreement is actually dangerous, but because the blueprint says it is, and the blueprint was drawn up when the child was 3 years old and had no other data to work from. The adult believes this reaction is just who I am. It is not who they are. It is who the room made them, and the room had a designer, and the designer was not them. This is not confined to families. Nations do it too. A society that has lived through famine will encode scarcity into its grandchildren's relationship with food, decades after the famine has ended. A generation that lived through war will pass down a hypervigilance that shows up, mysteriously, in descendants who have never heard a siren in their lives. Historians call this transmitted memory. The people carrying it usually just call it anxiety and assume it originated with them. The mirror that talks back. There is an old idea, refined across a century of social psychology, that the self is not something you have, it is something you catch, the way you catch a reflection in a window you're walking past. Long before you had an internal sense of who you were watching how other people reacted to you, and you were assembling an identity out of their reactions the way a detective assembles a suspect out of witness statements. Smile, and the room warms. Cry, and the room tightens. Ask too many questions, and someone sighs. A child does the math instantly and without appeal. This is what gets love, this is what gets distance, and the resulting spreadsheet becomes, over 20 years, something we mistake for a personality. This is why two people raised in the same house can grow into wildly different adults. They weren't actually raised in the same house. They were raised by the same house's reaction to two different children, and each child built a self in response to a slightly different mirror. The architecture nobody signed off on. None of this means you are a puppet. It means something quieter and, in a way, more unsettling. You are an author who inherited someone else's first 300 pages and was told to keep writing in the same handwriting. Most people do exactly that. They continue the manuscript without ever reading the opening chapters closely, because reading them closely means noticing the fingerprints of other people all over what they had assumed was solely their own voice. It means noticing that your instinct to over-apologize was drafted by someone else's temper. That your ambition was drafted by someone else's disappointment. That your very specific fear of being ordinary was drafted by a household that equated stillness with failure. The architecture of identity is not random. It is astonishingly well engineered for survival inside one particular environment, at one particular age, under one particular set of threats. The tragedy is not that it was built. The tragedy is that most of us go on living inside a structure engineered for a childhood we have long since left, in a world that no longer resembles the one the blueprint was drawn for. You are, in other words, an adult still following the evacuation plan of a much smaller, much more frightened building. The timing is the trap. What makes this architecture so difficult to see is not its complexity. It is its timing. The blueprint was drawn during the exact years when a human brain is least equipped to evaluate the material it is being given and most equipped to absorb it permanently. A child does not have the cognitive machinery to ask, is this rule actually true, or is it just true in this house? A child only has the machinery to survive the house it is in, and survival means adapting to the rules as though they were the laws of physics rather than the preferences of two exhausted, imperfect adults. This is why the beliefs formed earliest tend to feel the most obviously, unquestionably real. It is not that they are more true than beliefs you formed later, as an adult, with the benefit of comparison and evidence. It is that they were formed before you had any comparison available at all. A belief adopted at 30 competes against other beliefs you already hold. A belief adopted at 3 competes against nothing, because at 3 it was the entire visible universe. Inheritance without an inventory. Families rarely hand down their rules with a label attached explaining where the rule came from or why it exists. A grandmother's wartime frugality becomes a father's discomfort with spending, which becomes a son's vague, unexamined guilt every time he buys something for pleasure rather than necessity. By the 3rd generation, no one remembers the war. They only remember the guilt, and they assume it is simply their own personality, a fact about who they are rather than an artifact of who their grandmother had to become in order to survive a decade she never talks about. This is the strange economy of inherited architecture. The original cause can vanish completely from memory while the structure it built continues standing, indefinitely, waiting for someone curious enough to ask who actually poured this foundation, and whether the ground beneath it still requires the same precautions. Chapter 3. The Invisible Prison. A prison, in the ordinary sense, has bars you can see and a guard you can name. The prison this film is interested in has neither. It has no bars, because the walls are made of belief. It has no guard, because you learned, long ago, to guard it yourself. This is the part of the story most people never reach, because it requires admitting something that sounds almost absurd on first hearing. The very faculty you would use to examine your conditioning, your thoughts, your instincts, your gut feelings, is itself a product of that conditioning. You cannot simply think your way out, because the thinking apparatus was assembled inside the very cell you're trying to leave. The guard who believes he is free. Behavioral scientists have spent decades documenting a phenomenon that should unsettle anyone who prides themselves on being rational. The enormous gap between the reasons people give for their decisions and the actual, invisible forces that produced those decisions. Ask someone why they chose a particular career, a particular partner, a particular political conviction, and they will give you a tidy story, full of logic, full of agency. Look closer at the timeline, and you often find the decision was made in seconds, shaped by a mood, a memory, a fear the person cannot even name, and the tidy story was written afterward, the way a press release is written after the decision, not before it. This is not a flaw limited to foolish people. It is a structural feature of being a mind. We are all, to some degree, spokespeople for decisions we did not consciously make, standing at a podium explaining policies that were set in a room we were never invited into. The prison, then, is not a place. It is a habit of narration, the constant, comforting story that tells you every choice was freely made, every preference was freely chosen, every belief arrived at through your own careful reasoning. The story is soothing. It is also, quite often, false. And the most effective prisons in human history have never needed visible walls. They only needed inhabitants who were convinced they had built the place themselves. How the walls get built. Consider how a belief actually enters a person. It rarely arrives through argument. It arrives through repetition, through the emotional temperature of the room it was said in, through the authority of the person who said it, and through the age of the listener when they first heard it. A sentence said once by a stranger is an opinion. The same sentence said 100 times by a parent during the years a child's brain is still wiring itself for meaning becomes something else entirely. It becomes architecture. It stops sounding like a claim about the world and starts sounding like the world itself. This is how a child who was told, in 1,000 small ways, that ambition is dangerous grows into an adult who quietly sabotages their own success and calls it humility. This is how a child taught that love is conditional on performance grows into an adult who cannot rest and calls it work ethic. The walls do not announce themselves as walls. They announce themselves as personality, as values, as common sense. That is what makes them invisible. That is what makes them a prison. The economics of staying put. There is also a colder, more practical reason people stay inside the walls they were given. The walls are load-bearing. Entire relationships, careers, and identities have been constructed on top of assumptions that were never actually examined. To question the foundation is to risk the whole structure, and most people, quite reasonably, would rather live with a flawed foundation than with no roof at all. This is why confronting your own conditioning rarely feels like liberation at first. It feels like demolition. It feels like betrayal of the people who built the walls, who usually built them out of love, or fear, or the only wisdom they had access to at the time. This is perhaps the cruelest feature of the invisible prison. The architects were not villains. Many of them were simply passing on the only blueprint they themselves had ever been given, one more link in a chain that stretches back further than anyone can see. Which means the prison is not the work of one generation. It is inherited property, handed down the way land is handed down, the way debt is handed down, the way grief is handed down, quietly and usually without a will. And still, none of this is fate. A structure that was built can, in principle, be renovated. But renovation requires something most people never attempt: walking every hallway of the building with the lights on, and asking, room by room, who put this here, and do I actually want it? The prisons that recruit their own guards. History offers an unflattering mirror for this exact dynamic, at a much larger scale. Totalitarian systems have always understood something that individual psychology only later caught up to: the most durable form of control is not force. It is persuasion so total that the controlled come to believe the control was their own idea. A citizen who polices their own thoughts, out of genuine conviction, needs no guard standing over them. They have already been recruited into guarding themselves, and they will often defend the very system that limits them, because to question the system would mean questioning the self that was built inside it. The parallel to individual identity is not decorative. It is structural. Many people defend the beliefs that limit them with a ferocity usually reserved for defending the self, and this is not a coincidence, because by the time those beliefs took root, they had already fused with the self so completely that an attack on the belief registers, physiologically, as an attack on the person. This is why changing a deeply held, deeply inherited conviction so rarely happens through argument alone. You cannot out-debate a wall that believes it is load-bearing skin. The difference between a cage and a habit. It is tempting to imagine the invisible prison as something dramatic, a single traumatic event, a single villain, a single moment of imprisonment you could point to on a timeline. Occasionally that is accurate. But far more often, the walls were built the way a callus is built, through ordinary, repeated pressure, applied so gradually that no individual instance felt significant enough to resist. No single Tuesday made you afraid of disappointing people. It was several thousand ordinary Tuesdays, each one nudging the same wall a fraction of a millimeter further, until one day the wall was simply there, indistinguishable from the rest of the architecture, and you had long since stopped noticing it had a beginning. Chapter 4. Meeting Yourself. A door, finally. It is unlocked. It always was. No one told you. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives the moment a person first suspects that a belief they've held their entire life did not originate with them. It is not a loud realization. It rarely comes with fireworks. It usually comes in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, doing something ordinary, when a single question surfaces without warning. Wait, do I actually believe this, or did I just inherit it? That question is the door. Most people walk past it 100 times before they ever try the handle. The discomfort is the method. Meeting yourself, the actual self, underneath the installed one, is not a peaceful experience, and any account that tells you otherwise is selling something. The process typically begins with grief, because to separate your identity from your conditioning is to lose, at least temporarily, the comforting sensation of certainty. You will not know for a while which of your opinions are truly yours. You will not know if your ambitions are desires or debts. You will not know if the person you love because of who they are, or because their unpredictability recreates a childhood feeling your nervous system mistook for home. This not knowing is not a malfunction. It is the necessary first symptom of an honest inventory. A person who has never once doubted the origin of their own beliefs has not achieved clarity. They have simply never opened the box. Contemplative traditions across very different cultures arrived, independently, at strikingly similar advice on this point. Sit still long enough, and watch closely enough, and the mind will eventually show you the seams. The thought that arrives fully formed, wearing the clothing of your own voice, will occasionally flicker, just for an instant, and reveal, underneath, a parent's tone, a teacher's warning, a culture's fear dressed up as your own personal insight. You cannot unsee it once you've seen it. That is the beginning of choice. The difference between discovery and authorship. It is tempting, once the seams become visible, to imagine that the goal is to strip everything away and locate some pure, untouched self underneath, the fossil idea again, dressed in new language. But there is no fossil. There was never a version of you that existed prior to influence, waiting patiently to be excavated. This is not a discovery process. It is an authorship process. The task is not to find the real you hiding beneath the conditioning, the way you'd find a coin under a couch cushion. The task is to take conscious possession of the manuscript you inherited, to read every page, keep the sentences that still serve you, and, for the first time in your life, actually write some of your own. This distinction matters enormously, because discovery implies passivity. You simply wait, and the truth reveals itself. Authorship implies responsibility. You have to do something, and the something is difficult, and no one else can do it for you, and there is no guarantee you'll get it right on the first draft or the fifth. What survives the inventory? Not everything you inherited deserves to be discarded. This is worth saying plainly, because the temptation, once you glimpse how much of you was built by other hands, is to reject the entire structure out of spite, to mistake rebellion for freedom. But rebellion is still a reaction to the walls. It is not yet a life built beyond them. Some of what was installed in you was installed with extraordinary care. Some of the values handed down to you were handed down by people who were, in their own limited and human way, trying to protect you from harm they had already suffered. The goal of this inventory is not to burn the inheritance. It is to finally choose it consciously, rather than simply carrying it because you never noticed you had a choice. A belief you were given and later re-chose, with full awareness of where it came from and why, is no longer merely inherited. It has become, for the first time, actually yours. This is the quiet, difficult work of meeting yourself, not demolition, not blind inheritance, but selection, awake, deliberate, and entirely your own. The loneliness of the threshold. No one warns you that the early stages of this process can feel less like liberation and more like isolation. The people around you built their lives, often quite reasonably, on the assumption that you would remain the person your conditioning had made you. A partner grew accustomed to your accommodating nature. A family grew accustomed to your role as the reliable one, the funny one, the one who never asks for anything. When you begin questioning the architecture, you are not only questioning yourself, you are, without meaning to, questioning the arrangements everyone around you has quietly come to depend on. This is why the threshold moment so often arrives with grief attached, and why some people, sensing the coming disruption, retreat back into the old blueprint rather than continue. Months rather than days, the data eventually forms a map of exactly where the inherited architecture still runs the building, and where you have already, quietly, begun to run it yourself. It is not weakness. It is an accurate recognition that authorship has a cost, and the cost is sometimes relational, not just internal. The people who continue anyway are not braver by nature. They have simply decided that the cost of staying, over a lifetime, is higher than the cost of the disruption. Evidence, not assumption. The inventory this chapter describes is not an act of introspection performed once, in a single sitting, and then filed away as complete. It behaves more like evidence gathering than epiphany. You begin noticing, in real time, the moment a reaction arrives faster than thought, the flash of shame before you've even assessed whether shame is warranted, the reflexive yes before you've asked whether you actually want to. Each of these moments is data, collected patiently, OV. Chapter 5, Freedom. The same white room from the beginning. The same chair. But the light has changed, and so has the way it falls. Freedom is usually sold as an absence, the absence of rules, the absence of obligation, the absence of anyone telling you what to do. That version of freedom is a teenager's version, and like most teenage ideas, it collapses under its own weight the moment it's tested. A person with no structure at all does not become free. They become unmoored, and unmoored people tend to drift straight back into the nearest available current, which is usually just their old conditioning wearing a new outfit. The freedom this film is interested in is quieter, and harder to package, and far more durable. It is not the absence of structure. It is authorship of structure. It is the difference between a house you're trapped in and a house you've chosen to live in, room by room, with your eyes open. The weight of knowing. There is a cost to everything this documentary has asked you to consider, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Once you know that a belief was installed rather than chosen, you cannot fully unknow it. Once you notice that your fear of failure has your father's fingerprints on it, you cannot go back to experiencing that fear as simply, purely yours. This is uncomfortable. It is also the entire price of admission to a more honest life, and it is, by any reasonable measure, a fair price. Because the alternative, remaining asleep inside a structure you never chose, mistaking inheritance for identity, mistaking reaction for personality, is not actually more comfortable. It only looks that way from the outside. From the inside, it produces a particular, persistent ache that most people carry without ever locating its source, the sense of living a life that technically belongs to you but was never, quite, decided by you. Responsibility, not blame. It would be easy, at this point, to turn this film into an indictment of parents, of culture, of history, of every hand that shaped you before you were old enough to object. That would be a mistake, and it would also be a trap, because blame keeps you facing backward, and the work that actually changes anything requires facing forward. The people who built your earliest architecture were, almost without exception, doing the best they could with a blueprint that had also been handed to them. The chain goes back further than anyone can trace. At some point, the question of who is to blame simply runs out of road, and a better question takes its place. Now that I can see the walls, what do I want to build instead? That question cannot be inherited. It has to be asked personally by you, and it has to be asked more than once, because the walls have a way of quietly rebuilding themselves the moment you stop paying attention. Freedom, it turns out, is not a door you walk through once. It is a maintenance practice, a willingness to keep checking the architecture for the rest of your life. RD, that part, quietly, finally, belongs to you. A note on the long road. There will be no single day on which this work concludes. No ceremony marks the completion of an examined life, because the examination does not end, it simply becomes quieter, more familiar, more woven into the ordinary texture of living. Years from now, you will still occasionally catch a belief mid-sentence and recognize, with the same faint jolt as the first time, that it was never actually yours. The difference, by then, will not be that the walls have stopped appearing. It will be that you have stopped mistaking their appearance for an emergency and started treating it as simply what it is, routine maintenance on a house you have finally agreed to live in on purpose. What the chair was waiting for. Return, for a moment, to the empty room this film began in. The chair was never the point. It was always just a chair, plain, ordinary, waiting. What changes across the length of this story is not the room and not the furniture in it. What changes is who sits down, and why, and whether they know, finally, that they are the one who chose to. The chair remains. The room remains. But someone, at last, is sitting in it on purpose. Chapter 5, Freedom. The same white room from the beginning. The same chair. But the light has changed, and so has the way it falls. Freedom is usually sold as an absence. The absence of rules, the absence of obligation, the absence of anyone telling you what to do. That version of freedom is a teenager's version, and like most teenage ideas, it collapses under its own weight the moment it's tested. A person with no structure at all does not become free. They become unmoored, and unmoored people tend to drift straight back into the nearest available current, which is usually just their old conditioning wearing a new outfit. The freedom this film is interested in is quieter, and harder to package, and far more durable. It is not the absence of structure. It is authorship of structure. It is the difference between a house you're trapped in and a house you've chosen to live in, room by room, with your eyes open. The weight of knowing. There is a cost to everything this documentary has asked you to consider, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Once you know that a belief was installed rather than chosen, you cannot fully unknow it. Once you notice that your fear of failure has your father's fingerprints on it, you cannot go back to experiencing that fear as simply, purely yours. This is uncomfortable. It is also the entire price of admission to a more honest life, and it is, by any reasonable measure, a fair price. Because the alternative, remaining asleep inside a structure you never chose, mistaking inheritance for identity, mistaking reaction for personality, is not actually more comfortable. It only looks that way from the outside. From the inside, it produces a particular, persistent ache that most people carry without ever locating its source, the sense of living a life that technically belongs to you but was never, quite, decided by you. Responsibility, not blame. It would be easy, at this point, to turn this film into an indictment of parents, of culture, of history, of every hand that shaped you before you were old enough to object. That would be a mistake, and it would also be a trap, because blame keeps you facing backward, and the work that actually changes anything requires facing forward. The people who built your earliest architecture were, almost without exception, doing the best they could with a blueprint that had also been handed to them. The chain goes back further than anyone can trace. At some point, the question of who is to blame simply runs out of road, and a better question takes its place. Now that I can see the walls, what do I want to build instead? That question cannot be inherited. It has to be asked personally by you, and it has to be asked more than once, because the walls have a way of quietly rebuilding themselves the moment you stop paying attention. Freedom, it turns out, is not a door you walk through once. It is a maintenance practice, a willingness to keep checking the architecture for the rest of your life. RD, that part, quietly, finally, belongs to you. A note on the long road. There will be no single day on which this work concludes. No ceremony marks the completion of an examined life, because the examination does not end, it simply becomes quieter, more familiar, more woven into the ordinary texture of living. Years from now, you will still occasionally catch a belief mid-sentence and recognize, with the same faint jolt as the first time, that it was never actually yours. The difference, by then, will not be that the walls have stopped appearing. It will be that you have stopped mistaking their appearance for an emergency and started treating it as simply what it is, routine maintenance on a house you have finally agreed to live in on purpose. What the chair was waiting for. Return, for a moment, to the empty room this film began in. The chair was never the point. It was always just a chair, plain, ordinary, waiting. What changes across the length of this story is not the room and not the furniture in it. What changes is who sits down, and why, and whether they know, finally, that they are the one who chose to. The chair remains. The room remains. But someone, at last, is sitting in it on purpose.